Hello everybody and welcome again. We will follow up with our Dojo course. Last time we were just beginning with part development. So here is our first part called personalist part that we started to implement. Now last time we told you that there will be something remarkable about how we will implement the properties on the part, because we will do something very cool. Now this we will do today, but first we will create we will create a new migration, because we already have the personal record migration, but we will create a separate migration just to use our part first. And by the way, also to create our part record table, because we have our record here. So just as we have done with the person record, we should create a table from a migrations class. So let's do that, and let that be content migrations, for example. So I will add a new class to our project now, and it will be called content migrations. So this will be a migration. Oops. Again. Oops. There's some typo. And it will be very similar to our last migration. So here is our migration for personal record. Here we created a table, and by the way also added an index. I will just copy this and modify that, because it will be easier than just retype everything. Of course, just after Visual Studio has completed the background operation that runs in the foreground. Oops, not here, but here. So again, we will need a create method, and again we will need a create table call, because we want to create a new table for our part record, of course. We won't need an index now, so I just remove this. We have seen before this trick, or rather this practice of using the records type to have the table's name. So I will do the same. We need personalist part record. So that's how our table will be named. Oh, and by the way, last time we just learned about features. So here is this orchard feature attribute that targets our Dojo Course.module.contents feature that's also declared in our module.txt. Since what we write now is also part of this feature, it's also part of this sub feature, not part of this, but let's call it main feature or top feature. We will use this orchard feature attribute again. So so we make sure that our class is only used when this feature is enabled. So that means this migration will only run if this feature is enabled, not when the other feature is enabled. So we will need to apply this attribute. And now we will create the corresponding columns for our personalist part record. Luckily there is only there's just one column, max count. So we need an integer for that. We already have an integer column here, luckily, so I will just modify this. This is a simple integer, it's not a primary key, it shouldn't be auto-incremented, so we can leave it like this. Now there's one catch. Let's go back to personalist part record, and we have seen that this should derive from content part record. If we take a look at content part record, we see that there are two additional properties. So there's an ID built in, and there's also a reference to the corresponding content items record. We need to do something with these properties. We have to create corresponding columns in our migration. So let's do that. Luckily, we don't have to do that all by ourselves. because we have a helper for that, and it's called content part record. So by calling this method in this table creation command, it will add the necessary 2 columns to the table. Because if you take a look at the implementation, but only 1 column. That's interesting. Yeah, it only has the ID column apparently. The content item reference is only added for the version record, as it seems. Yeah, because by the way, we're going to take a look at that, but it's worth noting that this record, what we have here, is just a simple content path record. Now we have learned about Orchard's versioning capabilities in one of the first tutorials. So we also know that Orchard can store separate versions of a content item. And now by doing this, it also stores separate versions of content part contents, i.e. content part records. However, Orchard only does this if this record is not just a content part record, but a content part version record. So if you want to enable versioning for your part, then you have to derive from content part version record, and also in migrations use the corresponding content part version record method call. But this is not always necessary. So for example, here we don't want that, because why version this max count property? That's really not needed. So we will go with a simple content part record. Everything else is the same, so you just have to keep in mind this. Yeah, so that's that. Let's run this. So before we go further, let's run our module. So I'm hitting Ctrl F5, just so we can see how the database schema is updated. And after that, we will take a look at how to extend our migration with something else, and how to go further with content part development. Okay, so let's see what happens while it's starting up. The cold start is also always a bit slower, of course, than normal. So here is our beautiful green website, and if we go to modules, we should see our Dojo Course module content feature. Here it is. It is not enabled, so let's enable it. Okay, it has run correctly. So let's take a look at database. In the Server Explorer, yeah, apparently our server connection is broken, so I will re-add the connection. Let's browse to the database. It's of course in our Orchard folder /source/orchard.web/appdata/sites/default and orchard.sdf. Okay, so here's our database, and among the tables we should see our records table, and indeed here it is. So here is our personalized part record table. That's great, because that means our migration has run. It also has our max count column, so that's really great. In the next step, we will use this part somehow, but for that we need multiple things. First of all, we will need to make our part attachable, because if we now go to content definition, and for example, whatever, we go to the editor of the page content type and try to add a part, we see that our part is not listed here, unfortunately. It's not listed here because it's not attachable. So by not having our part attachable, we we won't be able to attach it from the UI here. Actually, that's not entirely true, because it seems it's entirely true, at least for now. Okay, so I'm going back to migrations, and what we will do now is we will make our part attachable, and also, so we can actually do something with it when attaching it, we will implement a so-called driver and a so-called handler. This is some necessary plumbing in content part development. So as we have learned before, to enhance our migration we have to write an update method. So that should be in the form of update from something, where something is the index of the previous migration step. So in this case 1. And in this update from we have to alter how our part is handled by Orchard in the content definition, and for that we will use an alter part definition method here, but that's an extension, so we need a namespace here, and because I can't really remember it, we will now go to, for example, comments, and in the comments module there's also a migration, and for now, just as a quite dummy example, I will copy every namespace over and then re-add the necessary ones. So that means we will have every migration related namespace already here, and this also means that we should have an outer part definition here, but sorry, it's not in schema builder but in content definition manager, yeah, here, and here is our outer part definition now. It's quite straightforward, so here we can modify the parts definition that's stored inside the Orchard content definition database. The first is the name. Well, this should be the name of our part, so we can use the same practice as with the report. So let's use this. Yeah, by the way, if you can't remember, this practice is good to aid development, because during development you might want to change your records or your part's name, and this makes it sure that you don't have to update this name string here, because it updates itself, or it's dynamic of course, but once this module is deployed and enabled somewhere, of course this name change won't be that easy, because it needs a migration to change the database table name, for example. But anyways, it's generally a good practice for aiding the first phase of development, and it doesn't really hurt later on either. And the next step is to actually call the alteration, and that's as many things in Orchard a delegate, and making a part attachable is just as easy as that. We should make it attachable. Also, once we are here, we will create a corresponding content type too. So this attachable makes it possible to attach our part from the admin user interface. So we can go to a content type and attach the part there. But we might also want to create the content type that we want to use from a migration as well. And that's quite straightforward too. Oops. That's quite straightforward too. We should use the content definition manager again, because we will now create a content type that does nothing really more than lists our person objects with person list part. So let's create that. Again, content definition manager, and this type alter type definition. So by the way, there's no create type definition, create part definition, there's just this alter. Just keep in your mind. Well, our content type could be named anything, let's name it person list. And the next step is to to build up the schema of this content type. So here we should attach our parts. Now this is again a delegate. So we commonly call this input here config. And here we have a nice fluent interface. So what to do with a content type? We could attach parts. So here is the with part method for that. This awaits the part names. So first we could attach our person list part. Then we could attach something else like the common part. The common part is commonly needed. So why not attach it? Let's also give a title part to this content item, because why not? We might need a title. Yeah, and this will be pretty much enough. There are some more complicated parts, but that's all covered in detail in our training demo module. So I'm sure you know about that, but just to make sure, I will show you it. Because our training demo module is very useful for learning Orchard. So on Orchard Dojo, it's reachable from under resources, and under resources there is our training demo module link. So here is just a bit of a description, but here's also the link to the Codeplex page where you can download it and take a look at the source yourself. But Codeplex is apparently a bit slow now. So there everything is explained in detail. What we don't cover here is also there. And one final thing, there are two, well, let's call it properties or attributes for content types. One notable and one is draftable and the other one is creatable. So these two kind of set up how a content type appears on the admin UI, how users can interact with them. If we make it creatable, and let's do that, this content type will appear here, and the users will be able to just create a new content item by clicking here. Draftable means that you will be able to create a draft of the content item, and if you are satisfied with it, then later publish it. So on contrary to that, if the content item is not draftable, that means that if you save it, it will be visible to the users from the front end immediately. Commonly what we want is draftable, but also of course it depends on the use case. So that will be enough. We now return 2 from here, because that was an update. And also the good practice, what we probably mentioned earlier, is to add everything that happens in the update methods to the create method as well. So I will do that now. Like this. And now our create should be turned 2. Well, this means that if somebody upgrades our module, so our module is installed somewhere where just the table was created, and then we release our update to our module with this update from one method, it will mean that the ones already having the module will get this update run. Now if somebody installs a module from scratch, then they will have everything, every migration in the create method. So for them the update methods won't run, and that's a good thing. Yeah, by the way, normally we don't have to copy paste everything because the upgrade is less trivial from that, less trivial than that, but this is just an example. Okay, so that's done here, but still our part won't really work. It won't do anything. It won't show anything. So what we will do now, that we will implement the necessary plumbing to first make its storage work, because if we have created our table here, we have defined our record class here, but still saving the records content won't work because Orchard needs some setup for that. So let's do it first. The thing that we need is called handler, and commonly we place it under the handlers namespace and handlers folder in our module. And I will create a new class here. Also, commonly, if the handler contains only code related to a content part, we name it conventionally as something part handler. So person-list part handler in this case. Now, what are handlers? Handlers are basically event handlers for content items. It's well, I don't really know of any related example out there or metaphors, but what we will use the handler now for is to create the necessary plumbing for our record. And how we do that is the following. All handlers, or rather commonly handlers, should derive from content handler. Also, if we take a look at the content handler class, we see how is it a kind of event handler for content types, because there are many on something methods. So it's on updating, on publishing, on removing, whatever. Now these are events, of course. There's many more to be used from content handlers, but it's quite complex, and in the beginning you won't need it. What we would necessarily need to do is to define a storage filter for your content part record. How you do that is the following. There's a filters property in the base handler, and you can add filters to that. Now what we need is a storage filter. Storage filters are defined like the following. Like storage filter for, and now it needs a repository. You should give it a repository that for this person-list part record. Do you remember we have used iRepositories before for accessing records? We will do the same now. So it's called iRepository, the interface that we used before, and this repository is for our person-list part record repository, person-list part record table. We should give that repository to the storage filter. That basically tells Orchard that, hey, if you want to save this or you want to do anything with the persistence of this person-list part record record object or record type, use this repository for it. Yeah. Pretty much that's the necessary plumbing here. Now we have the storage covered, but still we can't interact with our content part because there's no UI for that. There will be many new notions here. So stay with me, and everything will be complete in the end, and everything will be around in the end. The next thing that we will need is a driver. Again, drivers are stored conventionally under the driver's namespace, and they are called with the same pattern as handlers. So we write a driver for our person-list part. So let's call our driver person-list part driver. Drivers should derive from content part driver. And these content part drivers are generics. They need the parts name, they need the parts type as their type parameter. By the way, with the handler, I forgot about the Orchard feature attribute. We need that. With Orchard features, so with multiple features in a module, you kind of have to keep in mind that that you have to apply this attribute to every class in that feature. So person-list part driver, we tend to say that drivers are kind of controllers for content parts. So we have written quite a few controllers before, standard MVC controllers. Drivers are really a bit like controllers. Basically they handle handle some interactions with our part, and they also are needed for building the UI for our part. So here's our part, and we can't interact with it yet. But we will need is two things. One, we will need an editor for it. We need an editor that when we edit a content item that has our part, we need to edit this max count property somehow. So we need an editor for that. And we also need a display. So when our content item is displayed on the front end, of course we want our part to show something. And by the way, that will be a list of person objects, but we will need a display for that. And that's where parts come into account. How parts are developed is as the following. This is, by the way, an abstraction that makes part development a bit easier. But if we go to the content part driver definition, you will see that it's again some plumbing, but in the end, in reality, it's an content part driver implementation. So I don't think there is any place in Orchard where it's obligatory for you to derive from a concrete class, and something will work only in that way when you derive from a concrete class. Basically, everywhere where you hook into the Orchard API, you have to implement some interface. Here with drivers too, but the base interface is quite it's not that easy to use it, not that easy to implement it. So that's why there's this content part driver abstract class, and that's what we normally use. So let's write our display. Our display is in a virtual method already defined in the content part driver class, and that's this display. As you can see, it awaits the part object that we have here. It also awaits two additional parameters, the display type and the shape helper. We have mentioned display type before. Basically, it tells you it's a type. It's a category for how the content item is displayed. If it's in a list, for example, it's displayed in summary, in the summary display type. If it's opened like a blog post, it's displayed in the detailed display type. And the shape helper is here to create shapes. So we have taken a look at shapes when we have begun with theme development. We will use this shape helper, that's an object to create shapes. We use that to create our display shape. What we need is the following. We need to return a driver result here, so that we don't directly instantiate this driver result object commonly, because there's a method for that. It's called content shape. And the content shape, the overload that we use commonly is this one. So first it needs a shape type name. So we have to name this shape somehow. There's a convention for that. It's not necessary that you use this convention, but why not use it, because everybody is naming their shapes like this. The convention is that for part shape we use the prefix parts and then the part name. So in this case, person list. Also, there's a delegate that this method awaits, and it's called factory. This is the shape factory. So we should write a delegate that somehow builds our shape. It returns our shape. This will be interesting later when we learn about placement, and by later I mean in like 10 minutes or 15 minutes. For now, keep in mind that when you create your shape, you have to create it from such a factory delegate. Shape creation is as following. You need the shape helper for that. And since this is a dynamic, now it gets a bit more complicated, or rather you have to know what to do because there's no API shown to you by IntelliSense. What you do now is you create your shape. We have used this shape name here. We will use the same here. Actually, this here and this here is not the same, but I will again get back to this when explaining about placement. And basically, that's it. That's what you have to do necessarily. So you return a new shape that's called parts_person_list. So in the next step, what should we try to find some HTML template for that? We have to write that too. So let's go to our views and we will write our template for our part. This form of naming, so parts_person_list, gives us two options. We could either create a template that's called parts.personList, or we could create a subfolder, and that's what I will do now, called parts, and add a template called personList to this parts folder. So that should be a new item. It's HTML, personList.cs HTML, it is. So since we called our shape parts_personList here, Orchard will find it under parts/personList. And this is our display. We won't deal with anything yet. So let's just call this is personList and nothing else for now. We could also close it. We will also need an editor. So this display is displayed when the content item is displayed on the front end, but we can't edit the max count property in our content part yet. That's what we need a display for. So again, we will use we will override a virtual method. First, this one. It's quite similar to display. It also returns a driver result. So basically, we have to do almost the same, but in the display. I will write it now here. Again, we will use content shape. Again, we will need to give a name to our shape. It's also conventional. So here we use parts_personList. We will use parts_personList_edit here. So with the suffix edit. We will again need a factory for our shape. It will be quite similar. Now this time we won't create a shape like this, but we will use an editor template shape. Editor templates require basically three parameters that are really necessary. The one parameter is a template. Template is the file name of the template to be used. With editor templates is the convention that there will be a folder under views called editor templates, and under that we could use the same as with display templates. So we could have a part. Actually, we could have the same structure here. Oops. We could have the same structure here. So have a parts folder, and then under that a template. And here under template we should define the path to that template. So it's parts_personList. So we should give here parts_personList here. The second parameter is model. So we need a view model here for this editor template. And commonly for as the view model we use our part directly, so that's just part. We also need to give the prefix to the editor template, and that's just prefix. Now what is this prefix? This prefix is used by the MVC model binder in the background to distinguish between fields that are named the same. Because our person list part now has a field, or rather a property called max count. This will be displayed in the editor. It will be a text box called max count. Now if we have a different part that also has a property called max count and is displayed in the editor, there could be some naming clash, but with prefixes we can prevent that. If you take a look at this prefix property, I started to build with F11. Sorry about that. Okay. If you take a look at prefix, you see that by default it contains the name of the content part, and since content part names are well, they should be unique. This is a good guess. You don't have to override the prefix here if you don't want it. You can, because it's virtual as well. So that's it. One final thing here is that we should handle. Well, let's do that later. Let's try this now, and let's run our site and let's see what happens. Unfortunately, we will need to do some further implementations to get our content part working, but for now this is a good start. So let's go to content definition, and what we should see here is person list. Person list is here. It's also creatable, so it's here. If we go to its content type editor, we should be able to see our person list part, and indeed it's attached here. So that's what we have done from our migrations. If we go to the editor of our person list, indeed here is the title part. Here is the owner field from the common part, but nothing yet from our person list part. Although we have implemented our editor shape here, and there is also the editor shape, nothing yet there, but something should be output. Now the reason is that first we need a placement for that, and let's write it first, and during that I will explain you how it works. I will copy paste a placement from somewhere, well, again from comments, because it's easier like that. So we need that for configuring placement. We need a placement.info file. It's an XML file, and it has a structure like shown here. Okay, there is an author placement. What we need now, we need an entry in the placement.info file for our editor shape. This placement.info file, and generally the placement engine, handles how the shapes of the different parts are displayed among each other. So basically what you can do, you can modify with your placement, you can modify through placement in which local zone your shape is displayed. Because if you take a look at the home page, because for example there's the header zone inside a content item. There's also the meta zone for all kinds of metadata, and there's the content zone. So all these zones are parts inside the whole display of a content item. Through placement you can target your shape to one of these zones, and also you can change the order of these shapes. So you could define that I want my shape in the content zone, but if you want it before the body, you have to select an appropriate weight for that. So let's see how that happens. First, let's define a placement for our person list editor, editor shape. So we have to have a place element here, a corresponding attribute with our shape name, and a corresponding definition. So this content here is the local zone, and this 10 here is our weight. So this means that this shape will be displayed in the content local zone, in the content item, with a weight 10. So that means it will be displayed above shapes that have the weight 11, for example, or more than 10, but it will be displayed below shapes that have a weight smaller than 10. So let's save everything and let's reload our editor now. We should be able to see something from our shape template. Or not yet. Luckily this this error message is quite straightforward. So let's see what our issue is. This tells us where the view engine searches for our template. So here's our module, and we can see that it tries to search here, but .cshtml is wrong. So let's take a look at driver. Well, let's try it without the slash, but with this notation. So let's copy it in the editor templates root. Let's call our shape template parts.personList. Yeah, save all, and let's see what happens now. Well, something happens. At least dynamic compilation is taking place, but still nothing. But why is nothing here before the CSHTML? The solution is very simple. This parameter here is called template name, not template. Sorry, it's my mistake. Well, this is the downside of dynamic APIs, that you have to know everything from the top of your head, or even better, you have to copy paste from somewhere, or use a snippet for that. By the way, in the Orchard Dojo library there are many snippets. We have mentioned that before, but there's also a snippet for a driver. So you just type O driver, tab, and it writes the driver for you. So no this kind of mistakes. And indeed, here's our editor's content displayed here. Well, this is just a dummy, so we can't really edit our part yet. That we will try now. What we will do is we will just write a simple form here for our part. First, with editor templates, the thing is that you will have your part as a statically typed model. So the model for this template will be your type directly. That's unlike to the display template where there's a dynamic model, but we will see that later. So to tell your template that I'm using the statically typed model now, you should write model and then the namespace of your model, of your part class. Yeah. So let's write our form now. Well, commonly we only have one field now that we have to edit, but almost every time when we have at least two fields, we write a separate field set for our forms. In that field set we need a legend, of course, and so we will display a legend now through our t method, of course. Oh, well, let's call it person list settings. And now here we should write our form. Again, commonly we place our form elements into an ordered list, because that's how it is semantically, because it's an ordered list. There will be no list displayed, by the way. And then we can use some HTML helpers to display fields. So we have in our present list part, we have this max count. It's an integer. Well, we could have some kind of numeric up down, but that's I don't think it's still in HTML5. So let's just display a text box for that. So we will use the text box for helper. There are some delegate based helpers like this. You could use them like this. You should give them a delegate that returns the property. And this way it will generate a text box for you for the max count property. Also, we should probably display a label for the user, so the users can see what this text box is for. For that we use label for, and again this delegate based notation. The second parameter is again a t-string, so let's call all x maximal count. And here we have our form. You don't have to wrap all this in a form/form, because this piece of HTML will be injected into the middle of the editor form, but of course is wrapped into a proper form. So let's reload this now. Okay, we have something here. Well, it's not very beautiful, so let's add some class to this text box helper. With these MVC helpers, MVC style helpers, we could use anonymous methods to define HTML attributes. So this is what I will do now with defining a class, a CSHTML class on this element. The class will be text and let it be, I think it's called small. These are classes from Orchard. So let's reload it. Now we should have some little styling. Indeed, it looks a bit better. This was just some minor point. Okay, so let's do something. Let it be the first page list. What we have here, the maximal count for persons should be, I don't know, like 10, and let's publish it. And of course it's not saving for whatever reason. So what we do when this happens is that we attach the debugger to our IS Express and see what happens. But before that, we make sure that CLR exceptions, when thrown, are shown to us. So let's see what happens. Of course it's not saving, and of course there is no exception. The reason it's not saving that we haven't written any logic for saving it yet, because in our driver we have this editor method here, but this just displays the editor. We need something to handle when the editor is posted. There is also another editor for that. That's very similar to the first editor, but it has an additional parameter called iUpdateModel. This updater calls the MVC model binder in the background somehow. Basically, this updater will make sure to tie our part object to the post data. What we commonly do here, that first we return the result of this editor method, because this also needs to return a driver result. But we also have to update our part and this goes with the try_update model method. The model should be a part. We should again use the prefix here as a second argument. We don't need to specify anything to include or exclude. That's it. Yeah, so when we save everything, now our field should be saved, but first, of course, our orchard should be dynamically recompiled, at least our module. And that's what we see now. So now everything should be saved. Indeed, it is saved. Before we go a little further, let's take a look at our content list. Well, yeah, okay, sorry, nothing here. Yeah, by the way, you can see here is this publish draft button or link. That's because I only clicked saved before. So if I click publish now here, it won't have this publish now link here. So this is the versioning in the background. We have published our content item. There is no unpublished version. There is no draft version in the system. Okay, so let's see now something interesting now that we have something in the database. Because let's take a look at the database first. Let's go to our personal list part record table and show table. Right-click show table data. You see that we have a corresponding record to our personal list part record. Now this means that basically for every content part out there that has a corresponding record, there will be a separate table, and in the separate table there will be a separate row for every content item. Now this means that since we have our personal list part, personal list content type with the title, with the personal list part and the common part, this means that since we have three parts, we will have three separate records coming from three separate tables. So these separate records should be somehow joined in, or rather what happens with Orchard, most of the time they will be lazily loaded. So for example, when we display this editor, for every part, every content part, there will be a separate database call. Well, that's not a good thing, and that's what was recently overcome. There is an unreleased version of Orchard, or rather there's the development version of Orchard in the latest source code. And if you go there to the Orchard code website, to the latest source, we will see that there is currently a branch where some development is going on. Well, if it cares to open. Yeah, here we have our master branch, blah blah blah, and there is a feature, the shift branch. Now there is this very interesting thing called the shift. The shift consists of modifying every record using content part inside Orchard to use something more efficient than a separate table with a separate record. And by the way, by doing that, the modifications use something that was already there inside Orchard, but nobody really knew about that. So what we want to achieve is we want to achieve not to have separate database calls for every content part. What we could do, we could store our data somehow together with our content item. And by the way, if you take a look at the database again, there's an Orchard framework content item record table, and if you take a look at its content, we see that there is a column called data, where not really explanatory, but Orchard can store an XML in the data column, and that XML can store that XML document that's called info set, can store pretty much anything. So we can use that info set to store our parts data in this content item record table or if our content item is version, then in the content item version record table. And since these two, the corresponding records from these two tables are always loaded, there won't be a separate database call. There will be just some XML parsing, and that's usually faster than making a separate database call, especially if you are listing multiple content items, not just one. The API to use this info set is still under development. So as I said, it's unreleased. It will be most possibly in Orchard's 1.8 release, so the next release in the coming months probably, or a few months from now. So for now, what we will use is the API that's already there in 1.7. It's not that convenient than the new API or the enhanced API that will be in 1.8. But this is for demonstration. It will be easier to do all this what we do now in the release version. So what we'll do now, we will use the info set to store our properties data. And that means that if we access this part property, we won't necessarily go to the database, to the record, to fetch the properties content from there, but we will go instead to the info set part. So we have to modify our property. We will make use from it that it's a property. And in the get, we won't return the data from our record, but rather we will return it from the info set part, like the following. We need to access the current part object. Then we have this as method on our part objects. That's an extension method coming from Orchard. We have to kind of cast our part to the info set part, like this. We will take a look at the contents APIs later in this course. But for now, you should know that there is this casting. So if you have a content part or a content item object here, you can kind of cast it to one of its part with this as method. What we need is the info set part, and in the info set part there is a get method, and there is also a set method. So this is to store and retrieve data from the info set XML. So for the getter, we will need the get. It needs a part name and a field name, i.e. it will need our part's name, here person list part, and it will need our properties name called max count. Also, this get operates with a string. The get and the set operates with just string values, so we have to do something with this. Well, in.part will do the trick. And in the setter, we have to do a bit more. In the setter, we have to deal with persisting the data to the record and also persisting it to the info set. So we have to call the setter for the info set too. So the same data is in our record and it's also in the info set. So again, we will need this casting. But this time we will call set with the same arguments first. But the third argument should be the value. So this will be our value as a string. Not very sophisticated, but quite easy to understand. Now, why is it important to store everything in the record and in the info set as well? We store it in the info set, so when we display it, it will be fast. We don't have to fetch the record in the background separately. But we also store it in the record, because the record gives us the ability to query on these parameters. So if you want to query content items and say that I want to have every person on this content item where the max count property is less than 10, or less than or equal 10, you can't create such queries directly for the content of the info set. You have to have separate records for that. Let's pretend that we want to have such queries, what we will learn later. So we will need to store the data twice, once in the info set and once in the record itself. Let's reload everything. Let's take a look at the database later and see what happens. Probably I will get an exception here. Yeah, but unfortunately, since there's nothing in the info set yet, this will return a null. So I will place a check here, and it will be that well, info set value should be this, and if the info set value is null, now let's return 0, else let's parse the info set value. Of course, if you have already versy data in the database, this wouldn't be very clever, because it will display a 0 for every existing content item. But here we only have this single content item, so I won't bother with migrating the values. Such cases, for example, are already handled in the API that's in the Shift branch in the latest source code, but it will be released a bit later. Okay, so let's save 10 again. Okay, and let's take a look at the database now. Let's see what happens. First, in our person list part record table, we have the same. So we have the value 10 stored in the table just as before. But if you take a look at the content item record table, or the content item version record table, what the heck? Probably I should load this. What? Oh, oops. Well, it's not here. Sorry about that, but I don't know why. Okay, it was just the view was going stale, so we had to refresh the table content view. As you can see now, we have in one of our rows we have something in the data column. It's quite straightforward. So in the data root element, we have a corresponding element for our part, and in that we have a corresponding element for our max count property, and we have our value here 10. So it works. This is a very strong performance enhancement if you use the info set to store your properties as well. It prevents select n+1 cases to happen. Very important to keep in mind. You could try it out like this in your modules currently with Orchard 1.7, but if you wait a few weeks, probably a few months, it will be released with the API that makes all these getters and setters just one line short. So this is it. Our part now saves, but we can't really display it yet. Well, let's publish it. And if I go to the content list and go to view this part, view this content item, again, nothing is displayed from our part. So as you may have guessed, we also need to define the placement for our display shape. Because in our driver we have our display shape defined here, we have to get a corresponding entry here as well. So let's do that. I will just copy this entry from the editor. I will also copy the display shape's name. Go to the placement.info file. Our display shape will be displayed in the content zone with weight 10 again. So if I reload this, here we have our display shape templates content. Now there's a slight issue because if I go back to the dashboard and again to the content list, here we also have this is person list output. That's probably not something desired, because this means that the content from our display shape is displayed everywhere. But probably we don't want to display it in the admin listing because it's unnecessary to see it here. So we want to hide it from here, or better expressed, we only want to display this shape template, the shape template's content, when we open the content item like what we have done here. In the placement file, there are quite a few options you can use. It's quite well documented. If you go to the OCHA documentation, that's under understanding the placement.info file, you see it's quite well documented. There are a few options we could use here. One notable thing here is this match element and the corresponding display type attribute. Specifically with this declaration, so wrapping our placements into this match element, we tell Orchard to only display this shape when we are using the detailed display type. So this detailed display type is of course when we are looking at the content item in detail, like this. So it is displayed now. But this listing here doesn't use the detailed display type. By the way, it uses the summary admin display type, so it won't be displayed here. That's what we wanted, so that's great. Also, I told you before that to use these factory delegates is important for some reason. The reason is that, as you've seen, from placement we can control when a shape is displayed, and when a shape is displayed, we may want to display something that needs some computational overhead. So we want to show the user some complicated value, but of course we don't want to make that complicated computation when we are not displaying the shape. This delegate here, our factory, and well, this is the same, will be only called if the shape is actually displayed. So if there's a corresponding valid placement declaration. This also means that if you want to do some computationally intensive work just for your shape, you have to do it inside this delegate. So that's what I will do now. I will refactor this delegate to this full-blown form, not the one-liner. It's the same as before, just with a different style. And we will now pass a value to our shape. We will do something very simple here, but imagine that this is something computationally intensive. What we will do now, that we will pass the display type that's currently used to our shape, but in all caps. So let this variable be display type display type in caps here. we will just take the display type string and to upper and transform it to uppercase. How you pass arbitrary values to your shape is in this notation. You have to define the field. Well, it's the naming conventions go as with properties, so with a capital first letter here, and you pass any values to that here. This will mean that we will be able to access this display type in caps value from our shape template. So let's go there. I will copy this here. Let's go to our display template. So we don't display anything here, but now let's display our custom property. It's accessible like model.display type in caps. So this model here is dynamic. So if I start writing model, well, there is apparently no IntelliSense at all here. So I will just reopen this file and hopefully I will be able to show you. Yeah, so you can see the model is dynamic. So a dynamic object. There is no IntelliSense here. Nothing. Because display templates have such dynamic models. Remember that this is in contrary to editor templates, where you have a statically typed model. But don't be afraid, we can still access our content part object from this dynamically typed model too. There's a property on this model automatically created by Orchard. It's called content part, and that's where our content part object is. So we could have a nice code block here and cast that dynamic property to our content part objects type, real type. So we can have IntelliSense for just this variable at least. So let's cast this model.content part property to something static, because as much as we love dynamic, we also love static. So let's cast this to our content part type. Personalist part is it called. So this is a custom property that we just passed to our shape template. But now if you want to display something from your part, you could do it like this. So we will display the max count here. I will just insert a line break so we can see it. Now if I reload it, we should be able to see both of the values. But it takes some time since we modified our driver. As you can see, here is the value coming from our part, and here is the value that we passed to the shape from the driver. The power in this system is that you don't have to define view models. You don't have to define classes to just pass values to your shape template if you don't want to, because you have a dynamic view model, and you can add properties to that dynamic view model like this. In the, well, let's call it in the constructor of the shape, or through the constructor of the shape. If this value would come from a web service, for example, that takes a lot of time, we will be happy because, well, kind of, because this work taking a lot of time would only happen if our shape is only this. Would only happen if our shape is displayed, since everything we have done regarding the values needed in the shape template are produced in this delegate here. So the work is only done if we display the shape. Okay. Now, one final thing regarding drivers is that there is a lot more than just display and editor. We have learned about InfoSet part and how we store everything in the InfoSet part as well. Now, if you don't want to query on properties like max count here, you don't even need a record. we could just remove this record here, and our content part could derive from just content part. And we wouldn't need anything else. We would store everything in info set part. This would be a very nice, comfortable position for us, because we wouldn't have to deal any other storage related issues, not even from our driver. But here we want to query on our record. We want to have on our records property on max count. Thus we want to have a record, and this also means that we have to do something else in our driver too. Yeah, by the way, if you wouldn't use a record, if you just use InfoSet, you also wouldn't need a handler, because you wouldn't need the storage filter for your records repository. But now that we have a record, we also have to deal with import and export. So we haven't taken a look at that, but it's quite simple. So you can do it on your own. There is a module in Orchard called import export, and that import export module basically gives you a tool. It's built in import export. It gives you a tool to create an export XML file from the content of your site, and then import that XML in a separate site. So you can basically copy content between two sites, or even you could kind of make a backup from your site. Although that's not a complete backup solution, so it shouldn't be used as a backup. And it's a good practice, or rather that's almost obligatory in your for your part to handle import and export. That happens from the driver. So again, we should override some virtual methods. Specifically two things. One is for exporting the method called exporting. Surprisingly, I will just remove it from here that you can see the full signature. Export happens, as I said, with XML files, kind of like the info set. So we will build the XML to store our parts, to store every data from our part here. It's not very simple. You just have to keep in mind a few things, but again, if you are using snippets or any other means of code generation, this will be written for you, and you just have to fill in the gaps. So what we commonly do is firstly fetch the element corresponding to our part. So remember that this is XML, so we have elements. So we fetch the element for our part. And what we for type definition. Okay, so this element needs a name, and commonly the name for the element is the name of the part. So, and how we can fetch the name of the part is as following. Actually, there is a shortcut for that called part definition name. So this part.definition.name contains the name of our content part, but in this case, but not every time, is the same as the class's name, the name of the class. And now that we have the element, we add some attributes to it, and these attributes will store the data of our properties. So again, we add attributes to our element. Well, the name should be the same as the name of the property. That's max count, and the value is part.max count. So now that we stored what? Oh, sorry, it's not attribute but set attribute value. Yeah, that's it. This will work. So this will create something like this. So we will have a person list part element, and on that person list part element we will have a max count. The max count attribute that in the case of our first and only content item will contain 10. Yeah. So pretty much like this. We also need to handle importing, so the reverse. Again, we override virtual method. Again, we will start with something common, but this time we can't really fetch the element. It's a bit more, well, not complicated. It's a bit different how this part of the API works. But for the sake of convenience, we will save the name of the part in a separate variable, so we don't have to write this every time. Yeah, by the way, if you have multiple properties, there would be multiple lines like this. So this for another property. And to not repeat ourselves, that's why there's this element variable here in the first place. That's the reason for the part name variable too. Here we should take the import attribute method from our context. We have to specify the element name, so that's the part name. And now we can take several options. But first we have to specify the attribute name too, so that's max count. And now we can take two options. There are two actions that we can choose from. If you want to handle what to do when the attribute is empty or when there's no attribute in that XML for some reason, you could also specify the second action. Well, we won't do that because we won't need that now. But for the sake of safety, you could fill in that too. So anyway, we will use the first action, and the first action will return or rather the first action will set the max count property on our part from the value coming from the XML, what was just imported. So we set max count. It could be the value, but that's a string, so we need to parse that here too with import int.parse like this. By the way, with this import attribute method, you don't necessarily have to handle the cases when there's no value or when the value is null, because it's handled by the import attribute method. So this line will not fail because value is null, because it's checked somewhere else. Okay. So now we can have quite an overview of how content parts are built up. It's not simple. There are many pieces of API to learn from and to learn about and to know about and to understand. But let's reiterate it now that we have everything. First, of course, you need a model. Our part, the class, what we'll use later on. You could have just the part if you don't need storage in records. Here we also have a corresponding record because we want to query on the properties of the part, so we will need a record. So our record will be basically used kind of an index for our part, because with the info set we don't have to care about storage necessarily. We need a migration, so it's content migration, because we need to create the table corresponding to our content part record. We also set our part attachable. Yeah, by the way, I haven't shown you that. Now if we go to content definition, but of course it will take some time, again because dynamic compilation. Under content definition, we will be able to attach our part to any content type now, because it's attachable. So let's try with audio, add parts, and here is person list. By the way, this hint here that's displayed, that's another option on the alter part definition. So we could chain with description here. With description accepts a string, and you can give a nice description for your part. We haven't bothered with that. Also in migration, if you want to define a corresponding content type, that's not necessarily the case. When doing content part development, you can do it here as well. Once that is done, we need some plumbing for storage in a handler. That's always necessary if you have a corresponding part record. You always have to write this line. For every content part, you need a driver, regardless of what storage it uses. In the driver, you can define how the display shape is built for the part, how the editor shape is built for the part, how when the editor is posted that is handled. If you are using storage in records, you have to define what to do when exporting and importing. Once that is done, you could write the templates, the editor template and the display template. And don't forget about placement, because you won't get any errors, but just your shapes won't get displayed, and in the placement you have to define the corresponding placement for your shapes. So that was for today. In the next tutorial we will go on with some further finer details about content part development, and later we will dive deeper into the API of Orchard. So thank you for your attention, and see you next time.